Well, I invite you to take your copy of God's Word and open to Genesis chapter 28 as we find Jacob on the run. Jacob, a fugitive, Jacob fleeing from the land of Canaan to the land of Haran. And we meet him in Genesis chapter 28 on a starry night where God reveals himself to Jacob. Not because Jacob had found God, but because God finds Jacob. One of the most beautiful and powerful things that God can do is to reveal himself to us. When God reveals himself to us and shows us what God is really like, it is powerful. It is powerful to turn lives around, to transform stories, and to change trajectories. When you see God for who he is, it changes you. It changed everything for Jacob. Coming to saving faith is really coming to realize that God is God, that God is who he says he is. And when you come to saving faith, it is a turning point moment in your life in which the trajectory of your life is redirected. Christians call this conversion. Or if you want the biblical term for this, it's called being born again. Augustine, the young philosopher and rhetorician, experienced conversion in Milan, Italy. He had lived a life of debauchery and promiscuity and immorality, but in Milan, Italy, as he's searching for pleasure in all of the wrong places, he hears the voice of a child singing over a wall, "Take up and read," and he interpreted that as a word from God for him, and he reached for a Bible and opened up to Romans chapter 13 and read verses 13 and 14, which says, "Not in carousing and drunkenness, not in sexual excess and lust, not in quarreling and jealousy. Rather, put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the desires of the flesh." And Augustine was radically converted in that moment. Charles Spurgeon experienced conversion when, as a young man walking down the street in the middle of a terrible snowstorm, that weather drove him into a small Methodist chapel, and there was just a handful of people gathered, but he heard the preacher read Isaiah 45 and verse 22, "Look unto me and be saved, all the ends of the earth, for I am God, and there is none other." And Spurgeon was radically converted as he looked to Christ. C.S. Lewis, the atheistic professor at Oxford University, experienced conversion when, through a friendship with J.R.R. Tolkien, he became convinced of the truth of the Christian faith, and he came to believe not so much that he had found God, but that God had found him. And this is what Lewis wrote about in his little book called Surprised by Joy as he recounts his own conversion. He says, "You must picture me alone in that room at Magdalen College, night after night, feeling, whenever my mind lifted even for a second from my work, feeling the steady, unrelenting approach of him whom I so earnestly desired not to meet. That which I greatly feared had at last come upon me. In 1929, I gave in and admitted that God was God and knelt and prayed, perhaps that night, the most dejected and reluctant convert in all England." In Genesis chapter 28, Jacob experiences a conversion in the most unlikely way, in the most unlikely place, in the midst of the most unlikely circumstances. Now, Jacob had a checkered past up to this point. He had a good beginning. His destiny was declared by God before he was ever even born. God said that he would be the father of God's chosen people. As soon as you start to look at how Jacob lived his life, you realize that he was a slimy, deceitful, sinful supplanter. He takes advantage of his brother Esau in order to get his birthright. He deceives his elderly father Isaac in order to steal a blessing. And he hurts his brother so much in the process that Esau vows to kill him. So when you come to Genesis chapter 28, in Jacob's life up to this point, his life is a tragedy. Things don't look good. And in Genesis chapter 28, you find that Jacob is a fugitive. He's been sent away from the promised land back to his family homeland, Haran, in order to find a wife. And this is not a good thing. This is not a good going away. This is a fleeing. We're told in the previous chapter that he flees from Canaan. And so Jacob is a man on the run. Jacob is a fugitive at this point. But in Genesis chapter 28, beginning in verse 10, Jacob encounters God. And he encounters God in a way that changes him forever. Not because Jacob found God, but because God had found Jacob. And so I want you to see in verses 10 through 15 of Genesis chapter 28 how God reveals himself to Jacob. Look at what happens beginning in verse 10. It says, Jacob left Beersheba and went toward Haran, and he reached a certain place and spent the night there because the sun had set. And he took one of the stones from the place and put it there at his head and lay down in that place. And he began to dream. And this is what happened in Jacob's dream. A stairway was set on the ground with its top reaching the sky, and God's angels were going up and down on the staircase. And the Lord was standing there beside him. Some of you have a translation that says the Lord was standing above it. And this is what the Lord said. I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac, and I will give you and your offspring the land on which you are lying, and your offspring will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out toward the west, the east, the north, and the south. And all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you and through your offspring. And look, I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. For I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. Here, God shows up in the middle of the wilderness to a fugitive on the run and reveals something of who he is to Jacob. Now, what does God reveal about himself in the middle of this dream? I mean, what kind of God is God? Well, first of all, I want you to see that God reveals himself to Jacob as a God of access. A God of access. You see that in verse 12 as Jacob is sleeping and he begins to dream, and he has a dream. It's an unusual dream. He sees, in the middle of this dream, he sees a staircase that is reaching at the top into heaven, and there the Lord is above it, and it reaches all the way down and touches the earth, and then like a heavenly highway, there are just angels going up and down this staircase. Now, what's the staircase all about? Well, this is a revelation. A revelation is God revealing what he is like. A revelation just means an unveiling of what God is like. That's what the word revelation means. Sometimes we associate the word revelation with some weird things. You've probably read the book of Revelation, and if you think about the book of Revelation, you might think about the end times. You might think about airliners, crashing to the earth because the pilot was raptured or some other thing. We kind of get confused about revelation, but the word revelation literally just means the unveiling. And the book of Revelation, by the way, is not so much an unveiling about the end times, it's an unveiling of Jesus Christ. It's a pulling back the curtain, if you will, to see who Jesus is, what Jesus is like, and what Jesus is coming to do. And here, God is revealing himself, unveiling himself, pulling back the curtain, if you will, to show Jacob what he is really like. And he does this through a picture of a staircase. Now, this is a powerful picture of God opening up the heavens and coming down to meet Jacob. This is a picture of God building a bridge via a staircase between heaven and earth, making a connection between God and between man. And that shows us a powerful picture of the nature of our God, that our God is a God who makes himself known. Our God is a God who comes down to us. Our God is a God who opens up access to his presence to humanity. That's what this is showing about the nature and the character of God. And I think that that's very fascinating, because if you look in verse 12, it says that Jacob saw that the top of the staircase reached all the way into the heavens. Now, the last time you see that phrase, that the top reaching into the sky, the last time you read a phrase like that is Genesis chapter 11, when the people of Babel are building a tower to try to reach into heaven. And it says the top of it was intended to reach into the sky. Now, that's a picture of humanity trying to build a tower to get to God. What a contrast with a picture of a staircase here that shows not man trying to reach God, man seeking God, but God seeking man. God is opening up access for Jacob to encounter his presence and to be in relationship with him. Now here's the good news, church. The God of access who opened up his presence to Jacob is not just opening up his presence and access to his presence for Jacob. He is the God of access, not just for Jacob, he's the God of access for you and for me. And that's really good news. Jesus said this about himself in John 14:6. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except what? Through me. Jesus is how access into the presence of God is opened for us. And it is interesting that in the Gospel of John, Jesus actually refers to this particular story from Genesis, but says it in reference to himself. In John chapter 1 and verse 51, this is what Jesus says about the staircase. He says it's a picture of himself. He says, then he said, truly I tell you, you will see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. Jesus is saying that in some way, this story in Genesis chapter 28 relates to him, to who he is, and to what he does. In other words, the staircase is a picture ultimately of Jesus. The staircase, which formed a heavenly highway, if you will, between heaven and earth, is a foreshadowing, a preview, a picture, a sign of what Jesus would ultimately come to be and to do. Jesus would be the one who bridged heaven and earth. Jesus would be the one who opened up access into the presence of God for us. A number of years ago, when Amy and I lived with our family in Amarillo, Texas, we got a minor league baseball team that moved into town. They had a great name, the Amarillo Sod Poodles. Now, nobody in town knew what a sod poodle was, and I still think it's a made-up word, but apparently the people out in California who named the team, they said, well, it's how Texans talk about prairie dogs. Now listen, is there a single Texan in this room who's ever called a prairie dog a sod poodle? No. That's what people from California think. Anyway, here comes the team. We called them the Saudis for short. They built this beautiful stadium. In fact, it won like Stadium of the Year its first year. It was amazing. And Amy and I had season tickets the first season, and those tickets gave us access. But our access to that stadium was limited. We could come in the concourse, we could walk around the stadium, we could go down, we could sit in the seat that we had a ticket for. But there were some things I did not have access to. I couldn't get onto the field, I couldn't go in the dugout, I couldn't go in the locker room, because I didn't have access to that place. Until the end of the season, I was a friend with the on-field personality, the on-field announcer for the Sod Poodles, the guy who would come out and do all the silly games between innings and that kind of thing. And my friend Dennis called me at the end of the season. He said, hey, we're having an end of the season party, and I've been allowed to invite a few friends. Would you like to come with me? If you come with me, then you can see any part of the stadium that you want. And so I went to Saudi Stadium, and I got to go down to the place where I couldn't go before. I was able to go to the field. I was able to go to the dugouts. I was able to go to the lockers. I was able to go into the nice boxes. I got to see the whole stadium, not because I was anything special, but because of who my friend was. And because I was with my friend, he opened up access for me where I couldn't have access before. Now, folks, that is, in a nutshell, what the gospel of Jesus is all about. We have access to the presence of God, not because there's anything virtuous in us or anything in us that merits that access, but simply because of who our friend is, Jesus. And Jesus opens up access into the presence of God on our behalf, on the basis not of our merit, but on the basis of his merit. And notice that this access for Jacob is not because Jacob was worthy of it. I mean, up to this point in Jacob's life, he is a scallywag. Can I get a witness? I mean, nobody would want to be friends with a guy like this. If you just read Genesis 25, 26, and 27, Jacob is a not good guy. So access into the presence of God is not on the basis of Jacob's worthiness. God just graciously reveals himself and graciously creates access for Jacob to know him. And that's a really good word for us, because the reality is none of us in this room are worthy of the grace of God. If we were worthy of the grace of God, grace would not be grace. It would be earned, it would be deserved. Every single one of us is like Jacob, unworthy of the grace of God. Sometimes people will say to me, Pastor, I don't think I can have a relationship with God. I just don't think I'm worthy of it. And I say, good. Now you're ready for it. Because not a single one of us is worthy of the grace of God. That's the whole point. We're unworthy, undeserving, and yet that is exactly who grace is for. So if you feel unworthy, I've got good news for you. You qualify. If you're undeserving, you're exactly the kind of person for whom God's grace is given. God is a God of access for anyone from anywhere with any kind of background or past. It doesn't matter who you are or what you've done. If you realize your need for grace, God's grace is for you, and you can have access into the very presence of God through the work of Jesus in his death on the cross and his resurrection from the dead. There's a second thing that God reveals about himself in these verses, and that is not only that he is a God of access, but also that he is the God of assurance. The God of assurance. And we see this in verses 13 through 15. Now, Jacob at this particular moment in his life would have had all kinds of things to worry about. I mean, he has just had this moment of treason where he has betrayed his family and has deceived his father and deceived his brother, and he's now been sent out. He's fleeing from home. And there would be all kinds of worries and doubts in Jacob's life in this moment. I mean, just put yourself in Jacob's shoes for a minute. You are the grandson of Abraham. You are the son of Isaac. You are the promised inheritor of God's covenant. And yet now everything looks jeopardized because of your foolish mistakes, right? Jacob's sinful actions has tossed everything into the air. He's now on the run, and the future looks pretty bleak and pretty uncertain. And yet it is exactly at this moment that God, in pulling the curtain back and showing who he is and what he's like to Jacob, shows Jacob that he is a God who makes and keeps promises. And he assures him of his promises. Notice the nature of the promises in verses 13 through 15. The Lord stands there and says, I'm the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac, and I will give you and your offspring the land on which you are lying. Your offspring will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out toward the west and the east, the north and the south, and all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. And look, I am with you, and I will watch over you wherever you go. I will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I've done what I have promised you. Think about how assuring these words would have been to Jacob. Jacob has made such a devastating mistake in cheating his brother and stealing a blessing and deceiving his father. And now everything that he expected for his future is uncertain. He's not sure that he will ever inhabit the land because he's just been expelled from the land. Will he ever come back? He's not sure that he will have offspring that will bless the world because at this point in his life, he doesn't even have a wife and he's just been sent away from home. He's not sure that he'll ever return back to the land of Canaan. And in the midst of that uncertainty, God comes to him and makes certain promises. He says, I've been God of Abraham and I've been God of Isaac. And Jacob, I'm going to be your God as well. Notice the statements that God makes about himself in these verses. I am the Lord. I will give you this land. I am with you. I will watch over you. I will bring you back. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised. How much would Jacob have needed this kind of assurance at this moment in his life where through his own sinful actions, his own future is now uncertain and jeopardized? How reassuring would it be for God to come to him in this moment and say, I know you've been expelled from the promised land. I know that your brother wants to kill you. I know that you face an unknown future. I know that you have no land. I know that you have no wife, which means you have no offspring. I know that it seems as if your return to the land is uncertain. But this land that you've just left, I'm promising you one day will be yours. This offspring that you don't have yet, I'm promising not only are you going to have offspring, but through your offspring, I will bless all the peoples of the earth. And I know that you feel alone, Jacob, because you're out there on a starry night running from your family, but I'm promising you, I will be with you. And I know that you're going into a dangerous and unknown future, but I'm promising you, Jacob, I will watch over you. And I know, Jacob, you're not sure if you'll ever come back home, but I am promising to bring you back. And I'll never leave you until I have kept my word and done everything that I've promised to you. He is the God of assurance. Have you ever been in a situation in your life where you, through maybe your own actions, your own sin, maybe your own mistakes, maybe you say, I'm just not sure how it's all going to turn out now. I'm in a bad spot and things look bleak and I'm pretty desperate and I'm not sure how it's all going to turn out. Listen, look up to God. Notice all of the eyes in this passage. He doesn't focus Jacob on his circumstances. He doesn't focus him on his difficulties. He says, I will do this. This is who I am. I will be with you. I will watch over you. Listen, get your eyes off of your circumstances and get your eyes on the Lord and let your uplook change your outlook. He is a God of assurance. I love the language that he uses here in verse 14. Notice the word dust. I love that he uses that word because this is a reminder of Genesis 3 when Adam and Eve rebel against God, and part of the curse, part of the judgment is that they will return to the dust of the ground, right? That's the consequence for their sin. Here, through God's grace, he turns that upside down and says, here's how gracious I am to you. I'm gonna bless you in such a way that your offspring will be like the dust of the earth. Next time you dust your house, remember that God redeems dust. He turns consequences upside down. He reverses the curse, right? That's what the gospel is. It's a reversal of the curse. And that's what we see him doing for Jacob. This is the God of assurance. I love what Derek Kidner says about this passage. He says, here there are no words of reproach or demand, only a stream of assurances flowing from the central, I am the Lord, to spread from the past to the distant future, from the spot where Jacob lay to the four corners of the earth, and from his person to all mankind. Who is God? What is he like? He is the God of access, and he is the God of assurance. Amen? That's how God reveals himself to Jacob. Now listen, revelation always calls for response. When God reveals himself graciously to us, there's always a response that is demanded. And here we see Jacob respond to God. God's revealed himself to Jacob. Let's see how Jacob responds to this. And what we see here is that there is a conversion moment in Jacob's life. Everything changes for Jacob at this point. I want you to see three responses that he makes. First of all, Jacob becomes aware of God's presence. Look at what happens in verse 16. It says, when Jacob awoke from his sleep, he said, surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. You see, up to this point in his life, Jacob was going through life completely unaware of the presence of God in his life. And I think it explains why he does some of the things that he does. Why does he cheat his brother out of the birthright? Why does he deceive his father? Why does he steal the blessing from his brother? I think it's because he wasn't aware of the presence of God in his life. If you're not aware that God is with you, you start to take things into your own hands. And that's exactly what you see, the pattern in Jacob's life up to this moment. But now, because God has graciously pulled the curtain back and assured him, I am with you, Jacob wakes up to the presence of God in his life. And folks, I don't know a better way of talking about what faith means than that. Faith is waking up to the presence of God in your life. Faith is a kind of, you've been asleep. You've been unaware of God's presence. Faith conversion is that moment where the light bulb turns on and you see God as having been there the whole time. You come to believe that God is there and that God is for you. And that's what's happening with Jacob. He says, God was here the whole time, but I didn't know it. The Lord is in this place. I just didn't know it. God had been with him every step of the way. He was just blind to the presence of God. I think that one of the signs of a maturing faith is a growing awareness of God's presence in your life. It's coming to see that God was there the whole time. You just couldn't see it before. And the more you know him, the more you start to trace his presence in your life at pivotal moments. Have you ever seen this in your own life? Before you knew Jesus, you chalk things up to circumstance, to luck, to, whatever. But after you come to know Jesus, you begin to see, oh, that was God. Oh, God was there. I just didn't know it. Oh, that was God's presence in my life. And I think that part of a maturing faith is a growing sensitivity to, attentiveness to, awareness of the presence of God in my life. Before you know Jesus, you just have no sensitivity to it whatsoever. I think this is why someone has said that the greatest enemy to faith is not atheism, it's distraction. Satan loves to distract us so that we're not attentive to God's presence in our life. Amy and I have driven up to Colorado from time to time, and you know that if you're traveling interstate north, just to the west there is the Front Range of the Rocky Mountains. And sometimes if you go early in the morning, a fog will descend on the mountains, and you might be driving alongside the Rocky Mountains and totally unaware that they are there. Now, the mountains are there. You just can't see it because of the fog. Faith is like the fog lifting so that you can see what was there the entire time. You just didn't know it was there until now. That's what happens in the life of Jacob. He literally wakes up to an awareness of the presence of God in his life. When you come to know him, you start seeing him everywhere. So the first response that Jacob makes is that he becomes aware of God's presence. The second response that he makes is that you see him in awe of God's glory. He not only becomes aware of the presence of God, but he becomes in awe of the glory of God. Look at what happens in verses 17 through 19. It says that Jacob was afraid. He wakes up, he says, God was here, I didn't know it. And so he was afraid. And he said, what an awesome place this is. Now that is how probably all of us would respond if God showed himself to us in a dream. Awesome. Notice the two words used here. He became afraid. The word there is fear. It doesn't necessarily mean that he was scared. It has more of the idea of reverence or being astonished or being in awe of something. That's what it means to have the fear of God. It means that you are in reverence of who God is, that you're in amazement of who God is, that you're astonished by who God is. And then he says, what an awesome place this is. Sometimes I think minimize, and I'm the worst at this, we kind of minimize the punch of the term awesome because of its overuse. I use awesome all the time. I think my dog is awesome. I think Bluebell ice cream is awesome. I think my wife is awesome. I think you are awesome. I think the Astros are awesome. And all those things are true. But when we say awesome, what we're talking about is something that is truly full of awe. Someone has said only God is truly awesome, truly full of awe. Here, Jacob is in awe of the glory of God. He realizes the one in whose presence he had been. And his response is astonishment and amazement, true awe. What an awesome place this is. It's kind of like when you go to the Grand Canyon. Have any of you ever been to the Grand Canyon? Nothing can prepare you for it. I mean, people say it's huge, it's amazing, all these things, and you kind of have in your mind, like it's gonna be amazing, it's gonna be big, but nothing prepares you for how big it is. You stand on the edge of the Grand Canyon and you're like, it is bigger than I imagined, it is bigger than I thought it would be. Folks, that is the right response to God. When you begin to see and understand who he really is, he begins to appear to you bigger than he was before. Not smaller than he was before. Sometimes, and this is really a sign of immature faith, you begin to think, oh, he's not that big of a deal, or he's smaller, or he's not that impressive, or I'm kind of bored, or I've heard this before. Maturing faith comes to see God as bigger and bigger and bigger and more amazing and more astonishing and more awesome to you today than he was yesterday. When you really get a vision of the glory of God, you say, God is bigger than I have ever imagined him to be, and I see him as bigger today than I saw him yesterday. That is the right response to the revelation of God, is to say, what an awesome God he is, and to stand in awe and amazement at his glory. Jacob sets up a marker to remember it. Look at what happens. He says in verse 17, he was afraid, and he said, what an awesome place this is. This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. So early in the morning, Jacob took the stone that was near his head and set it up as a marker. And he poured oil on top of it and named the place Beth El, which in Hebrew means the house of God, though previously the city was named Luz. This is what Jacob does. He wakes up, he becomes aware that he had been in the presence of God, although he was unaware of it before. He stands in awe and astonishment and amazement that he has been in God's presence. And so he takes that stone pillow that he had slept on, and he sets it up as a marker, as a stone pillar, to remind him of his encounter with God. Now, he had seen his grandfather do this from time to time. He'd seen his father do this from time to time. Abraham, anytime God would do something powerful in Abraham's life, he would build an altar. And Isaac does the same thing. When he sees God provide wells in the wilderness, he builds an altar. Jacob is by himself on his way to Haran. He doesn't have the materials to build an altar. He only has this stone that he's been sleeping on. And so he takes that stone, sets it up right as a pillar, as a marker, the closest thing he can do to making an altar, and he pours oil on it. Now that's a powerful image of consecration. This is what you see Moses do, for instance, in the tabernacle. Takes all the elements of the tabernacle, he anoints them with oil, consecrates it as something holy. This is what Jacob is doing. He is saying, I want to consecrate this place as an altar to always remind me of God's having revealed himself to me. The reason that you need reminding, the reason that Jacob needed reminding is because we tend to forget. The reason that you have altars in the wilderness, the reason that Jacob set this marker up was so that he would remember never to forget that God had revealed himself there, that he would remember never to forget what God had done. Listen, one of the greatest assurances of God's faithfulness in the future is his faithfulness to us in the past. One of the greatest markers and assurances that you can have that God will be with you tomorrow is to be reminded that God was with you yesterday. And we tend to forget that. We tend to come into circumstances that are daunting or bleak, and we begin to have doubt and worry because we forget the faithfulness of God in our yesterdays. Have you ever noticed that? Something comes up in your life and you're like, oh my goodness, how's this gonna work out? I'm so worried about this. And we tend to forget God has been faithful so many different times in the past. Jacob is setting up a pillar so that he will remember never to forget. We need to be reminded of God's faithfulness to us in the past so that we can be assured of God's faithfulness to us in the future. Amen? You gotta find ways to remind yourself of your awe at the glory of God. You need to be reminded of the reality of the presence of God in your life. You need to put down those markers, those pillars, those altars in the wilderness to remind you of the faithfulness of God in your yesterday so that you can be assured of God's faithfulness in your tomorrow. I know people who have kept prayer journals for years, and they are able to mark and account for the faithfulness of God in their past. We have friends who have a jar, and it's full of stones, and anytime they see God's activity or faithfulness in some way or an answered prayer, they'll write that story on a stone and they'll drop it into that jar, and that jar is full of stones. And around the dinner table with their kids, if there's ever a moment of doubt or worry, they can pull out those stones and read those stories and remind their kids kids of God's faithfulness to their family. Folks, this is what Jacob is doing. He is in awe of the glory of God. He is serious about the glory of God, and he is wanting to remember what God has done for him. There's one final response that Jacob makes in this passage to God's revealing himself, and that is in verses 20 through 22. We see Jacob not only being more aware of the presence of God and being in awe of the glory of God, but in verses 20 through 22, Jacob pledges allegiance to the supremacy of God. He makes a commitment for God to be supreme in his life. Folks, that is what conversion is. Conversion is that moment where you say, I'm no longer my own God. God is God. That's what conversion is. It is a dethronement of the creature and a recognition of the enthronement of the Creator. And that's what happens in Jacob's life in this moment. Look what happens, verse 20. It says, then Jacob made a vow. Now in Hebrew, it literally says he vowed a vow. In the Hebrew language, if you want to emphasize something, it's very easy. All you have to do is repeat yourself, like a preacher. So for instance, if you want to emphasize the holiness of God, you don't just say God is holy. What do you say? God is holy, holy, holy. You just stack it up and repeat it. That's what the author does here. Jacob vowed a vow. It's to emphasize the vow. It's to emphasize Jacob's commitment. And this is what the vow is. He says, if God will be with me and will watch over me. Now that's what God had promised to do, right? I will be with you and I will watch over you. He says, if you will be with me and if you'll watch over me during this journey I'm making, if God provides me with food to eat and clothing to wear, and if I return safely to my father's family, look at this, then the Lord will be my God. He will be my God. This stone that I have set up as a marker will be God's house. And I will give you a tenth of all you give me. Okay, so let's just look at this passage. First of all, notice a statement of his commitment. He says, if God will do this, then God will be my God. Now, some scholars read that passage and they throw some shade on Jacob for this. They say, okay, it looks like Jacob is, kind of putting conditions on his obedience. If God, you'll do this for me, then I will do this for you. And if that is the case, then that would be an example of Jacob not quite getting it, because we should never attach any conditions in our obedience to God. We should never say, God, if you'll do this for me, then I'll do this for you. But I actually don't think that that's what Jacob is doing here. I think actually Jacob is making a faith response. And I think the language that Jacob is using is the language of covenant. Because in the Old Testament, when covenants would be made, there would always be promises and there would be obligations. In other words, when you made a covenant with someone, you had to agree to terms. So if I, for instance, say, Greg, I will sell you my car if you will pay me. Okay, that's a promise, and there's also obligations. And for Greg to enter into that covenant, he has to agree to the terms. He has to say, okay, I will pay you if you will sell me your car. I think that's what Jacob is doing here. He's not attaching conditions to obedience. He is taking God for his word. God has made certain promises. Jacob is committing to the obligations here. He's saying, God, if you are who you say you are, then you'll be my God. God, if you keep your end of the deal, I will agree to terms. I think, in other words, this is the language of Jacob entering into the covenant, him agreeing to the terms. God, if you are who you say you are, then you will be my God. And there's a significant change that Jacob uses here, because back in chapter 27, you'll remember when in the midst of Jacob's deception of Isaac, Isaac had told Esau, go kill an animal and bring me a meal. And you remember Rebekah overhears this and tells Jacob to go do this. And Jacob brings a meal to Isaac before Esau can do it. And Isaac says, how did you get this food so quickly? And you remember what Jacob says? You got to pay attention to the language. He says, because the Lord, your God, made it happen for me. In chapter 27, Yahweh is Isaac's God. In chapter 28, after God reveals himself to Jacob, Yahweh becomes Jacob's God. This is a faith response. Jacob is saying, God, you will be my God. No longer someone else's God. God, you will be my God. He is committing himself here to God. Folks, this is conversion. This is what we all must do if we want to know the Lord. There has to be a moment where we say, I'm not any longer my own God. And I look at the God of the Bible, and he's no longer your God or their God or someone else's God. God is my God. God is supreme in my life. That's the statement of his commitment. But then there's a sign of that commitment, and you see it in verse 22, the sign of his commitment. He vows to give God a tithe. Notice that in verse 22. He says, I will give you a tenth of all that you give me. The tenth is the word tithe that we use. This is the second time that you find it in the book of Genesis. The first time is in Genesis 14, where Abraham gives a tithe to the priestly king Melchizedek. Now here's a second time that the term tithe is used, and Jacob is saying, God, you are going to be my God. I am pledging allegiance to you. But the sign of my commitment to you is that the first tenth of everything I have belongs to you. Now let me clarify what Jacob is doing and what he's not doing. He's not saying, God, you own 10% and everything else belongs to me. No, it's exactly the opposite. A tithe is a reflection of the fact that God owns 100%. A tithe is a reminder for Jacob that everything he is and everything that he has is now God's. And the 10% is just that regular reminder in Jacob's life, everything I am, everything I have belongs to God. And I'm gonna remind myself by every time I have an increase, giving 10% of it to remind myself, God is God, God is God, I belong to him. Everything I am is his. Everything I own is his. The tithe is the reminder and the sign of his commitment to God. We had friends in 2020 who let us borrow a ski boat for a summer. It was wonderful. It was the COVID summer. It couldn't have come at a better time. Everybody else is masked up at home. We're out on the lake. It was great. Our friend called us. He said, hey, I have two boats, and one of them is just going to sit in the garage unless you think you can use it. And do you think you could use our ski boat? And I said, well, let me pray about it. Yes. So we went on every weekend. We would take that boat out. It was wonderful. Now, can you imagine if my friend Chad called me in the middle of the summer and said, hey, I know I've loaned you the boat for the summer, but could I just use it for this weekend? Can you imagine if I said, no, it's our boat? That would be ludicrous, right? Because it's not my boat. It's his boat that he has entrusted to me. It's on loan. It belongs to him. And it would be ludicrous for me to say, you can't have any of it. It all belongs to me. Now see, that's what a tithe is about. Everything you have and everything you are is on loan to you by God. It's entrusted to you. You're a steward, not an owner. And a tithe is that regular reminder, God, actually, everything I am, everything I have is yours. That's really what Jacob is doing. It's a sign of the fact that his allegiance is to the supremacy of God in every area of his life. And he's going to remind himself of that regularly by giving 10% back to the Lord. Folks, that is the proper response. When God reveals who he is to you, the right response is to respond by giving him completely all of who you are and all of what you have. Listen, when God reveals himself to you and you realize who he is, you should respond by committing everything to him, saying, God, you are my God. When you skydive, there are no half measures. You fling the totality of yourself out of that airplane. And that's faith. There's no holding back. There's no half measures. No, you fling all of yourself towards the Lord. No conditions attached. God wants unconditional surrender. You just say, God, you're my God, and you own me. I belong to you. It's why we are called slaves of Christ in the New Testament. Listen to what Tim Keller says, and I'll close with this. Tim Keller says, when you come to Christ, you must drop your conditions. You have to give up the right to say, I will obey you if, I will do this if. As soon as you say, I will obey you if, that is not obedience at all. You are saying, you are my advisor, not my Lord. I will be happy to take your recommendations, and I might even do some of them. No. If you want Jesus with you, you have to give up the right to self-determination. Self-denial is an act of rebellion against our late modern culture of self-assertion, but that is what we are called to, nothing less. Folks, that's conversion. God, you are my God. Saying with C.S. Lewis, I give up. God is God. And if you see him for who he really is, that's the only way to respond. Amen? If you're here today and you know Jesus, would your prayer today be, God, help me have a growing awareness of your presence. Help me have a growing astonishment at your glory. Help me have a growing submission to your supremacy. If you're here today and you don't yet know Jesus as Lord, then I want to urge you to make the declaration, God is God. Say with Jacob, you are my God. If you've never come to that point in your life where you have been ready to make that decision, but you'd like to make that decision today, I would love to talk with you about how to do that. In a moment, I'm going to pray, have a closing word. Lots of people are going to be going out of this place, but I'm going to be staying around. I'll be down here at the front. And if you would like to come to faith in Jesus and make him your God, declare that, I would love to talk with you about that. So you just come see me after the service. Lord, we are so thankful for who you are. Thank you for revealing your